What I hope it does do, which some of you will appreciate, is draws on some very recently available data from the 2016 census, and which has only been published in the last few weeks, and also brings that together with data about Aboriginal population and the housing situation, particularly in this state, but some comparators across the whole of Australia. So there are three main sections in the talk. I'll start off with talking about population and how it's recently changed, particularly in New South Wales, and then talk more about the housing circumstances of the Aboriginal population in New South Wales, and the housing facilities and conditions, and then just try and summarise what I think are some of the key points. So the sources, apart from the census, are mainly from the New South Wales government data, which is annually updated through the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare and published by the Productivity Commission in the report on government services that some of you might be aware of or familiar with. And some of that comes from also, there's data directly from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare from their social housing survey, which they do every 2 years. So let's talk first about the Indigenous population of Australia and New South Wales and recent change. So the first graph is showing you the distribution of population 2016. So what this is talking about is the entire national population as identified in the census. 650,000 Indigenous people logged in 2016, a huge increase since 2011. The whole population is increasing, of course, but a faster increase than the population overall, of 100,000 or 18% more in just 5 years, which is a very big figure. So that's now coming up towards 3% of the population logged in the census. But there's also an undercount in the census, which is measured in a survey that the ABS does afterwards, and that taking that into account as well suggests the true number is really quite a bit higher than that. Is in fact coming up towards 800,000 people in the whole of Australia, more like over 3% of the population. About it looks as if, so this is people who self-identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and that it appears from the census that there are people who were counted in the 2011 census as non-Indigenous, but in the 2016 census chose to identify themselves as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders. So there's an estimated number of 40,000 people across the whole country who have newly decided to state their identity in that way. Well over half of the national Indigenous population, this is what's shown in the graph, is in New South Wales and Queensland. The populations in the other states, Indigenous populations in the other states, are quite a lot lower. And this is showing the numbers in a slightly different way. This is illustrating the percentage of Indigenous people in the population of each state and territory, illustrating that although the numbers in Northern Territory are quite modest, as a percentage of the population, it's a huge proportion, and all of the other states are much lower. New South Wales is somewhere around the middle of the pack, around the 3%, which is normal for the whole country. Population growth over the last 5 years has varied in speed in different states and territories. New South Wales is not only the state with the largest overall population of Indigenous people, but also almost the fastest growth rate, very close to Victoria and ACT, which have much smaller populations. So what that's saying is that over time, the whole of the indigenous population of the whole of Australia is becoming a little bit more concentrated in this state. Within New South Wales, and one could do the same for other states as well. Of course, it's very important to understand the geography of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander population, and across the whole of New South Wales, there's quite a strong contrast between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations shown in the graph. So the blue part is the proportion of each of those two population groups that live in Sydney. A third of Indigenous population, but 2/3 of the non-Indigenous. And the rate of increase during the last 5 years has been about the same for Sydney as for the rest of New South Wales. So that distribution hasn't changed in the last 5 years. The population, the Indigenous population in both of those geographic areas has been rising at roughly the same speed. Now let's turn to disadvantage. What does the latest census tell us about that? Well, there's a wealth of data in the census that can shed light on that, and some of that actually isn't available yet. Doesn't get published till next year. But this is just some very simple observations from the data that has already been published, and a comparison, the change over the last 5 years. At the national scale, the median or typical incomes for the Indigenous population have actually risen a little bit faster than for the rest of the population. So that's quite a good news story. So what that means is that the median or the typical Indigenous income has risen by 21% in that period, in those 5 years, and the national all ethnic origin number has risen by about 17%. So it's a little bit ahead, but catching up from a long way behind. Individual Indigenous incomes are actually only 2/3 in the Indigenous community as in the rest of the population. Now, this is a graph which comes in from actually earlier census data. This might be a little different in 2016. This, I think, comes from 2011 census, and this comes courtesy of my colleague near the front, Vivian Milligan. But I think it tells a very important story about which has implications for the profile of housing need that applies to the Aboriginal population. Really significantly different from the wider population. So this diagram is illustrating the blue is the Indigenous population and the red non-Indigenous, a very, very different shape of the population. And basically what that's telling you is there's a much larger proportion of younger people, of children, of young adults in the Indigenous population. Larger house, and that implies larger households, more families, more extended families, and the tendency towards much smaller households, which has been going on over the last century in the general population, hasn't been shown up in the Indigenous population. So there is still a substantial need for larger units of accommodation for family-size housing. So let's move on then to housing and talk a little bit about the current housing, or the latest data we have on housing circumstances and recent trends. So the first one, again, comes from the census and is illustrating the change over the last 10 years, 2006, 11 and 16, from the census, the breakdown of the Indigenous population by housing tenure, just breaking it down to the very, very simple categories of homeowner, private renter, social renter. What that's showing is that there's been a 75% increase in both homeowner and private renter numbers. That's the blue part of each bar and the red part of each bar. Both of those you can see have increased really quite substantially going towards the right-hand side. There's been some increase also in the social renter part, but much more limited. And there's an obvious reason for that limitation, because the size of the social housing portfolio stock in the country has been almost static over that time. So there's a limit to how much the Aboriginal population in social housing can increase. So looking at this in a bit more detail, focusing on Indigenous home ownership, this is a concern which is echoed in the national government closing the gap monitoring reports, which come out annually, I think. This is one of the statistics which they pay attention to. It's almost one of the only ones in the housing space, actually. What we can see from this graph is some sort of a contrast, some sort of a variation in the trends, because the red bar is the non-Indigenous population and the blue is the Indigenous population, 2006, 11 and 16. And there's a slow but continuing increase in the level of home ownership in the percentage of the Indigenous households who are homeowners of all Indigenous households, from 36% to 40% in the last 10 years, whereas the non-Indigenous home ownership rate is actually falling, and is possibly falling a little bit faster than those figures imply. So there is some kind of a contrasting trend there, which I think is quite important. What we don't know is the extent to which the rising Indigenous home ownership rate is perhaps a little bit a result of people identifying as Indigenous in the census in the 2016 who didn't in 2011 or 2006. Maybe that could be part of the explanation, but that's something that needs looking into in more depth. Let's compare then in this graph New South Wales and the rest of Australia. We can see a slightly higher home ownership rate in New South Wales compared with the rest of Australia. On the left-hand side, the blue part of that bar is a little bit bigger than the 40% for Australia on the right-hand side. But within New South Wales, it isn't shown in this graph, but I can also tell you that the rate of home ownership in Sydney in the Indigenous community is about the same as it is in the rest of New South Wales. Let's focus then on another part of the housing system, the social housing sector. Only 5% or less than 5% of the entire housing stock or of all households. But just to say something very, very briefly about how that splits, most of you in the room would be well aware of this, but just to make the point very briefly, 3/4 of that social housing in New South Wales is public housing, owned and managed by government, and community housing is 20%. That's the red part. And then the green and the purple are the specifically Indigenous housing sectors, roughly the same number of houses run by AHO and by Indigenous community housing providers. The share of Indigenous people of all public housing or all social housing is gradually changing. And this graph tries to show for most of the states how that sort of looks at the level of Indigenous population in the social housing sector and how that has been changing since 2011 from annual data from state governments. And the numbers in the middle, starting with 15 and ending with 19, represent New South Wales. Represent the public housing stock in New South Wales. That's the percentage of new tenancies in the stock that are being allocated to Indigenous applicants. So gradually rising in most states, and New South Wales is somewhere in the middle of that group. So let's focus even more narrowly then onto public housing, just the public housing part of that social housing picture. And this is just trying to illustrate the public housing system in New South Wales compared with all the other states and territories, indicating that about one public housing tenant in 6 across the country, about 16%, is an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander household. The true figure is probably a bit higher than that, but that's what the statistics show. And New South Wales is there somewhere in the middle with about 14%. So that is fairly close to the national norm. Okay, moving on to the final main section of the presentation, just to talk about some data on housing conditions from these data sources, that all the ones that I've mentioned at the beginning. Firstly, talking about overcrowding, and these are census numbers. So this is focusing on New South Wales specifically across all housing tenures, and illustrating, comparing non-Indigenous on the left to Indigenous on the right, and the height of that bar is the percentage of the whole household population which is overcrowded as recorded in the census. The blue part is severely overcrowded, at least 2 bedrooms short of what the household should have for that number of people. And the red part, overcrowded but not severely overcrowded. That's where at least 1 extra bedroom is needed. It's overcrowding, but it's moderate overcrowding. So nearly twice as high an overcrowding rate overall in this community. This one is just thrown in very, very briefly, not specifically about housing, but sort of interesting perhaps, a number that's easily extractable from the census, illustrating what to me was a quite surprising statistic, suggesting that the percentage of Indigenous households who have the internet at home is high, pretty high, just over 3/4, and lower than the non-Indigenous population, but not by a lot. That's the blue part of that bar is the percentage of all households who have internet access at home. Going back to the overcrowding theme, though, and let's talk about overcrowding not across the whole population, but just in social housing. So what this is doing is it's comparing 2012 and 2016, and comparing state-owned and managed Indigenous housing, in other words, Aboriginal Housing Office, with public housing, and showing that the overcrowding rate in AHO property is significantly higher than it is in public housing for Aboriginal tenants. Sorry, this is for all. This is not for Aboriginal tenants. This is for all. This is for all households in public housing. Correct myself there. We'll come on to Indigenous overcrowding in a moment. There hasn't been. I think the trend over time is not such an encouraging story, because there's no clear pattern of improvement there. The 2016 figures are pretty much the same. Indigenous community housing overcrowding rates are much higher than these numbers in other states. So this is not. There are actually parts of the country where the problems are much more significant. New South Wales Indigenous community housing sector overcrowding rates are not published, so we don't know what they are. Then focusing specifically on Indigenous tenants in public housing in New South Wales, and comparing overcrowding rates in different parts of different parts of the state. So this is New South Wales and Australia. New South Wales is in blue, Australia is in red. So this is illustrating how the overcrowding rate for Indigenous people living in public housing varies between major cities, inner regional, outer regional, remote and very remote places. So the scale up the side is the percentage of all the Indigenous tenants in public housing in those places who are overcrowded. And there is quite a variation. In New South Wales, it's actually, the overcrowding is more common in Sydney than in the other parts of the public housing system, not by very much, but by a bit. In the rest of Australia, overcrowding is much more significant in remote and very remote places, not so much in major cities. Getting towards the end, so I think this is perhaps 2 slides from the end. This one is looking at the proportion of the population living in poor condition housing in different parts of the social housing system. So this is focusing just on New South Wales. This data comes from no, this, I think actually it says New South Wales. I think this might be national. I think this is probably a national figure, in fact. This data comes from a tenant survey that's run by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare every couple of years that covers all social housing tenants. So these are numbers that come out of the answers that tenants give to questions about your home. They're not, a surveyor's expert judgment or anything like that. But they're the best we have because we don't have more objective data. The way that they define a poor condition property is a property that has less than 4 working facilities or more than 2 major structural problems, or both of those things. And working facilities means washing clothes and also your own washing facilities and kitchen facilities. So the percentage, the scale up the side is the percentage of all responding tenants who live in a house that is poor in one of those ways. All of the numbers except for community housing look pretty high, even for community housing, it's 12%. The New South Wales public housing, maybe it is public just for New South Wales, does have the highest rate of property condition, of poor condition in the whole of Australia. So we have public housing first, then community housing, then AHO property, which has got a significantly higher rate than these two, Indigenous community housing slightly lower. Public housing, Indigenous tenants, that's a very high proportion of the public housing tenant population who, the Indigenous public housing tenant population who are living in poor conditions. That's a serious issue that I think ought to be at the top of the agenda for asset management and housing strategy for FACS. And what do tenants think about these services? This also comes from the AIHW survey. This is looking separately at public housing, state-owned and managed Indigenous housing, which in this case would be AHO, and community housing on the right-hand side, and comparing the blue, which is what Indigenous people think, and red, which is what the non-Indigenous tenant population thinks. This is the percentage of each of those groups which is satisfied with the service they get and the house that they're living in. Slightly lower rates for Indigenous tenants in both public housing and community housing, which I think is a little bit of a concern, although the younger age profile of the Indigenous population probably means that the usual tendency is that younger people expect more, are more critical, and that can have a little bit of a skewing effect on numbers which otherwise might look the same. The AIHW, although it publishes figures for state-owned and managed Indigenous housing, which in this case is AHO, alongside these other tenures, it warns you that you should be cautious about making that comparison because it's a slightly different methodology for collecting the data. But nevertheless, it I think still tells a story which is a good indication. So just to summarise, final slide. The Indigenous population is rising very quickly. That's confirmed by the 2016 census, faster than the general population. There is some evidence from the last two censuses that there is some catch-up going on in terms of incomes and in terms of home ownership rates, but from a much, much lower base. There's a higher incidence of vulnerable people and household types in the Indigenous population, significantly higher. There's a very, very different demographic profile which of the two groups, which implies different, considerable difference in housing needs. Home ownership is rising, but relatively slowly. There is a growing concentration in social rental housing in this state and elsewhere of the Indigenous population, which means that it's obviously of interest to try to improve the quality of that sector, which has been neglected very badly, both mainstream and non-mainstream. There's a higher incidence of overcrowding and poor conditions experienced by Indigenous households. Not something that is particularly surprising to us, but we can measure how much what the difference is from some of these figures, which I think is hopefully useful. And that is reflected in slightly lower satisfaction rates for Indigenous tenants in social rental than the general population of social renters. Thank you very much.